This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Can I welcome members and officers here at City Hall and the public in the gallery or watching on the webcast to today's meeting of the GLA Oversight Committee. Please may I remind participants to turn your phones off or put them on silent, and can I also ask members to ensure that electronic devices are not placed in front of their microphones. Guests, if I also ask you if you're having any mic issues, if you pick it up by the base and bring it to you and not the gooseneck, that would be marvellous. Can I ask the clerk, Nicoletta Kemp, to confirm any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received from Assembly Member Fortune, Assembly Member Boff and Assembly Member Baker.
Thank you. Can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? And can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in specific items listed on the agenda? Thank you. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting on the 17th of January 2014 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. Summary list of actions. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the Oversight Committee? Thank you. Actions taken under delegated authority, and there's been a fair few bit of completed actions off our work programme, which is good, so hopefully you've had a chance to look at those. Can we note the recent actions taken by me as Chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree the following? The committee's letter to the Mayor of London regarding the arrangements for PQT, the committee's letter to the Mayor of London regarding the report on equality, diversity and inclusion, expenditure of up to $8,500 for the Assembly Chair's annual event, the committee's letter to the Chief Officer on the GLA Workforce Report, and the committee's letter to the Chief Officer on the HR IT Services shared transfer. That's all to be noted. Thank you. Okay, if we could now move on to today's principal business, which is a discussion on the London Partnership Board. I'd like to welcome Luke Bruce, the Interim Executive Director of Strategy and Communications from the GLA. Good morning, Luke. Phil Graham, the Executive Director of Good Growth from the GLA. Daniel Patridge, Co-Founder and Director partnering Regeneration Development PRD Limited. We also have Piali Gupta, Director of Strategy at London Councils online, and we'll also be joined by James Lee shortly, who's a disability campaigner and consultant on social inequalities and is also a member of the London Partnership Board. If I could open up and just ask you all to explain as briefly as possible your relationship to the board, just so members have a clear sense, that would be good. Starting with you, Luke.
Sure. So I'm a senior official at the GLA with overall responsibility for the management of the board and its development.
Hi, I'm Phil Graham. As Executive Director for Good Growth, I was very heavily involved in establishing the London Recovery Board, which was the precursor to the Partnership Board, and particularly the economic element of that board's work, and have continued to participate in and to support the Partnership Board as they have picked up and carried on with that work.
Hi, so PRD were commissioned to undertake an evaluation of the London Recovery Board, a qualitative evaluation last summer, and that led into recommendations to help shape the London Partnership Board following.
Thank you. Piali, if I could come to you online.
Thanks so much, and good morning, everyone. I'm one of the senior officers at London Councils, and I work very closely with Luke's team actually to help plan an agenda, pair meetings, and obviously support both Councillor Gould in her role as co-chair, but also the other members from London Councils who sit on the board in a cross-party basis.
Thank you. And James will be with us shortly, and he's a member of the board, so members are aware. I'll come to you first, Luke, if that's okay, and ask what are the key achievements of the first year of the London Partnership Board?
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for inviting me here today. As we noted, the Partnership Board started its work less than a year ago in March 2023. As we've already discussed, the board evolved from the London Recovery Board, which was established in 2020 to help guide the city's recovery from the pandemic. Over the period of the pandemic, the importance of approaching the capital's problems as a partnership really came to the fore. And as we moved on from recovery, there was a clear desire from leaders from across the city to continue to work in that way and to try and tackle some of the bigger, longer-term challenges facing the city. The Partnership Board has a wider remit than the Recovery Board. Membership has expanded to include sectors such as housing and sport. As I'm sure we'll hear from other panel members, in establishing the board there was a considerable amount of engagement, including evaluation to understand what the members themselves and their organisations wanted from it and what success looked like. So over the course of the year, the board has focused on 3 key challenges: supporting Londoners with the rising cost of living, making the economic case for housing in the city, and exploring how we extend opportunities for young people to access skills they need for future jobs in the green economy. The board has also continued to oversee the Building a Fairer City Action Plan and the London Anchors Institution Network. So some specific examples of success. Over the course of the year, the board has brought together organisations to learn from each other on what works in tackling the cost of living crisis. Interventions include supporting staff to be trained to give initial first aid type advice on cost of living challenges, so people get the advice they need quickly. It's provided advice and input in how to improve the GLA and London Council's joint work on retrofitting London homes, and is developing research to support a blueprint for delivery on the model of retrofit across London. The board's also been recognised by the government as a place to engage senior leaders across the city. For example, the Levelling Up Advisory Council London Workstream is working through the board. An example of the London speaking with one voice. And then the Anchors Institutions Network has recently released its impact report, which demonstrated, among other things, £1.75 billion of contracts have been signed by network members for small to medium-sized enterprises, and over 5,000 staff upskilled to respond to climate change. As well as its direct achievements, I think there's a less measurable but equally important success, which has helped establish and develop a culture of partnership across London. For example, it set the tone for the way London approaches its work with boroughs and partners. The recent joint position paper from the London Housing Delivery Task Force is a good example of that. I'm sure Phil and Piali will talk about the other approaches, the way we now approach economic development in a different way than in the past. And you'll see, I think, the priorities of the board reflected in the individual work programmes of member organisations. Just to pick the cost of living example again, clearly remains a core part of the GLA's budget for next year and its work programme. The board continues to develop, and there's always improvement and new approaches. We want to develop the way we work between meetings, providing more space and support for members and their organisations to come together. And we want to identify more opportunity to talk to or more opportunity to link the work of the London Partnership Board with the work of other boards across the GLA and indeed across London. Finally, of course, we need to see what happens after the election, but I think there's broad support for the board, but more importantly, the approach that it embodies.
Thanks, Luke. Just on some of those specific examples of success you listed around the first aid for cost of living crisis, retrofitting, and the blueprint for retrofit. Obviously, those are all things that could be delivered by organisations on their own. So what is the key mechanisms the board have used to enhance that work?
So if I take the cost of living example first, so it's absolutely the case that there was a huge amount of work, particularly over the winter of last year, that went into dealing with a very acute problem of cost of living across the city. What I think we learned from that was that, well, firstly, there's some very good practice, but there's some practice which we, perhaps organisations, thought was successful, but weren't as successful as they might have thought would be. And there were particular interventions that we were better than others. So I give the example of training people in kind of immediate first aid type advice to support folks with advice immediately. So what the board did was to bring together. We commissioned some research, which the board helped develop. We brought working groups together across the summer to discuss that research, to agree agree how agree which interventions were most successful, and to consider how each individual would represent that work within their own organisation. Phil will want to talk, I'm sure, a bit more about the retrofit advice, but retrofit is a really good example that the GLA on its own cannot tackle this problem as itself. It needs to find a way and a mechanism which the board provides for coming together to agree the priorities, to be able to speak in particular to government with one voice about what London's needs are about retrofit, and to have a common framework which everyone can identify themselves in. Each partner, boroughs in particular, will have their own role in that. G15 housing, for example, social housing groups, but the importance of the board being able to knit and bring all that together through working groups, through the culture that it's established, and through commissioning particular pieces of work and helping organisations prioritise, is the added value of the board.
Thank you. And Piali, could I come to you online for your take on those questions?
Absolutely. And actually, if you don't mind, I will build on the retrofit example, because it's absolutely an example where no single organisation is going to tackle. So just to kind of lay out where we're at with retrofit, at the current rate we're retrofitting in London right now, we won't retrofit all the homes that need to get to a higher energy efficiency level until the 22nd century. And that's not due to lack of trying, to be honest. There's logistical barriers, supply chain barriers, but there's also barriers around just people being confident, residents being confident about letting people into their homes to do the work. And so we, at our first meeting of the Partnership Board, had a very deep dive session trying to bring together that range of perspectives we had around the room. So we had everything from the NHS, who feel the effects of cold homes, to universities who are doing some of the really technological innovation around how to actually improve the way that we treat our homes, to businesses who are part of the supply chain and are just really finding it hard to predict and meet demand. And then obviously housing associations, both in the form of boroughs but also the G15. So we had a real range of perspectives who could help us think through how to solve the range of challenges that we're facing. And unfortunately, I can't really get into the work that we've since commissioned. I know Phil and I would both be very happy to come back, and Georgia Gould as well. Delighted to come back and talk about where we get to in a few months' time. But we've really actually come to some really helpful findings that could help us both improve some immediate improvements in the system that could really start to kind of help to speed up delivery, help the supply chain to start, scaling up for demand, but also more importantly, really think about some of those future big, ambitious solutions that could start to unlock both better use of public money, but also attract private finance. So that's one of the examples where we couldn't have done that with just, for example, London Council sitting down to think about it, or even for that matter, London Councils and the GLA going into a little locked room and thinking about it. We're going to need all of those perspectives in the room to get to that next stage of solution. A couple more that I wanted to, from different angles. We had a really good housing discussion, and I don't need to tell you, any of you members, that housing is the top crisis in London right now. I mean, not just homelessness, but just the lack of affordable housing, housing standards, every indicator. We track indicators on a bi-monthly basis. Every indicator is going in the wrong direction. And again, that's not through trying. Boroughs are building more than they've done for, decades. But the market is just, the headwinds are really difficult. And we brought a conversation to the Partnership Board that set out a number of the challenges. And what's been amazing since then is how much the partners are now telling the London story and taking it into places where, for example, I as a borough representative can't do, because for example, the business secretary is not necessarily going to listen to me, but we've got our business representatives going in and talking to the business secretary about their recruitment and retention challenges that are coming from housing. We've got the G15 going public about some of their difficulties in building. So we're coming at it from a number of different angles, but telling the same story at the same time. And that's incredibly powerful, because no individual one of us can actually reach all of the audiences we need to reach in order to unlock the investment for housing. And then finally, I'll just end on the one point that I think there's a real risk of always focusing on the meetings and the agendas and the formal aspects of what happens at the board. But actually, what's been really encouraging to me is all the activity that's starting to happen outside of those board meetings, just because we're actually learning more about each other as partners. For example, just before Christmas, the NHS came to us as London councils and really wants to do some work on health and housing. We've been trying to have that conversation for a very long time, but actually it's because we sit at that board together, we're getting more familiar with each other, we're just getting that time together and chatting in the margins. That's going to unlock so much. Similarly with higher education, London Higher, I was aware of them, they were aware of me. We're now having bi-monthly meetings because we just see the value in spending that time together. So those are just some of the examples of both the tangible but also the intangible results from the partnership board.
Thanks. And if I could stay with you, Piali, and just ask, what key lessons from the London Recovery Board experience were in influencing the development of the London Partnership Board?
One of the things we learned, because we did debate a little bit about, it's co-chaired by the Mayor and Councillor Gould, and we thought, should we be opening up the chair really and rotating it to make it a true sort of partnership feel that everybody could lead this board. But actually, one of the things we learned is that our partners across the city really valued kind of that convening power that the Mayor and Councillor Gould had. So that was one of the elements that we thought was really important to retain coming into the new partnership board. But what we also learned at the same time was actually setting the agendas and what the items for discussion was going to come. We've been really much more deliberate about opening that up to the partners, and more of our partners are leading those items, suggesting items. The next one we're going to have actually a really fantastic one that's going to be led by the youth representatives on the board. They've set that agenda. We haven't interfered. We haven't kind of managed them to death in sort of a bureaucratic way. And I think that's become a really important part of it, which is using that convening power of London government, but at the same time really opening up the ability of our partners to start setting our priorities.
Thank you. And we're now joined in the chamber by James as well. And James, just before we started, we did a little brief intro of all our guests' relationship to the partnership board. So I wonder if you just wanted to briefly outline what your relationship is.
Sure, no problem. Apologies for joining you slightly after the start time. Sorry, I was held up at a previous meeting. So I am on the board as a co-opted member. I am on the Mayor's Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Group, and it was felt that it would be pertinent to have some advice from an equalities perspective co-opted onto the board. So that's my relationship onto the board. Thanks.
Thank you, James. And did anyone else have anything to add, Phil, on those questions?
Can I just add very briefly, Chair, in relation to your point about what the fact that some of this could happen by organisations taking these decisions individually. I think in many ways you're absolutely right, but it didn't happen. And I think what the partnership board has provided, certainly from where I sit as an officer, is that in the most basic way, it would suddenly be very embarrassing to come in front of that group of people with our colleagues in the boroughs, with our colleagues in civil society, with our colleagues in other parts of the private sector, and not be able to tell a consistent shared story and to be able to set out a consistent shared strategy against some of these really big challenges. So instead of being in a position where there's a sort of a set of individual impetuses to try and collaborate, but everyone's thinking about it in their own way, the fact that we need to come together and be able to talk to the most senior leaders within London government, but also within the wider public sector, the private sector, civil society, really forces us to think, along with our colleagues in the boroughs, along with our colleagues in other parts of the public sector, about how we are going to collaborate and how we're going to work together to get these goals in a way that I don't think has been the case previously.
Thanks. And Piali picked up on the chairing arrangements and kind of who's leading the meetings. Luke, was there anything else that you think's changed or been a lesson learnt from the recovery board or influenced how the partnership board runs?
Well, I certainly think there's a change in the way that officers across London, in the boroughs, in London councils, the GLA, and as Phil says, other organisations, feel that they've got a space and access to start to talk through challenges and issues. So there's a sort of cultural shift that's happened as a result of the recovery board into the partnership board. There's also a way in which we've engaged, I think, with government in a different way. So coming together on, for example, the Levelling Up Advisory Council is a good example where in the past I think the the government would say that it's quite hard to get a London view. London's complex, difficult. I mean, still the truth, but there is a space now, and you can see that in some of the way they engage and some of their thinking about how they engage on a number of programmes. That the partnership board is the opportunity for them to come together. So I think probably those two areas are things that really stand out to me.
Thanks. Before you came, James, we were talking about the key achievements of the London Partnership Board. As a co-opted member, what have you think's been a key achievement, and is there anything you think is perhaps holding the board back, or things that you think could allow it to create even greater change?
Sure. It's a really good question, and I have no notes in front of me, so I'll speak from the heart what I've experienced on the board. In terms of key successes, I think that I managed to catch a bit of what Piali was saying about the value of bringing together such large institutions across London, the ability to coordinate, to work together, to be on the same page in our efforts to ultimately improve the lives of people across the city. I mean, that's what the board is all about. If I think about some of the particular tangible successes that I've seen, I think about the equality and fairness programs that have run through the board, the levelling up work that's been done through the board. That's been really powerful for people. Building a Fairer City has been such a fantastic program, I think, that's had a real tangible impact on people already. If you think about some of the challenges, I mean, one of the things that I learned only recently, so don't judge me for this, is that, you know, whilst we can do almost anything, especially with a group of such wonderful, powerful institutions around the table, we can't do everything. And I think that's the great challenge of the board, is to try and focus and to find a way in which it can achieve the tangible things for Londoners without getting too lost in the weeds around sort of, you know, that ability. You know, we can do anything, but we can't do everything. So where do we focus our efforts? That, I think, is a great challenge for the board.
And so how do you overcome that challenge when it comes to, I suppose, prioritisation and making sure everyone's heard and, you know, has the same priorities of what can be changed?
Absolutely. It's a good question. I think colleagues from the GLA have been really instrumental in helping us to focus in on what is within the gift of the board and the partners around that board, as it were. They've been really helpful in helping us to refine and shape our thinking around where we want to focus our efforts. Partners from across the board as well will know the areas in which they can make the most impact with the help of other partners on the board, and that, again, that's the great value of bringing together such a diverse range of institutions, from the NHS to universities to the fire service and so forth. So it's been a co-designed program of careful cooperation, I think, that has helped us to find where the various partners around the board can make an impact. It is a challenge. It will remain a challenge, and I think that it's something that we think about quite a lot in terms of where we can have a good impact.
Yeah. It's a big board and a lot of members to find agreement, which is both has its benefits and, I suppose, as you outline, its challenges. Luke, could I ask you what's been the impact on the London Partnership Board from the recommendations from the GLA Oversight Committee in March 2023?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Just before we move onto that, I just reflecting on James's point. I think this issue, and it may come when we discuss about valuation, about being really clear what the board can do and how it's not duplicating has been, you know, hugely important for us, and that that focusing on a few things rather than trying to do everything does feel to me like the right way. Of course, the problem with that is you then lose some other elements of it. To your question, Chair, so I mean, we wrote back to the board after we saw you in February last year. I think you had, we had six recommendations. I mean, I think there were a mix of things. I think the area where we haven't made the sort of progress that the board would want is around publishing hard data on the individual plans and programmes of organisations. I mean, that isn't felt that that's the board's role. some of the things around ensuring, for example, cost of living crisis and structural inequalities remain central, and we've just talked about that a lot. That's very clearly continues to be very much part of the board's work. We've establishing performance metrics for individual pieces of work really does, we feel, sit with the individual organisations. It's not for the board to manage other organisations across London. There are plenty of other spaces for that, and that considering how we report on the progress of the board without producing another accountability and another oversight structure, I think is a challenge. You asked about coming back to here on a year-to-year basis. Well, we're here a year on, and very comfortable and supportive of the challenge that the Assembly provides.
Thank you. If I move on to you, Daniel, if that's okay, and ask what are your view of the recommendations outlined in the London Recovery Board evaluation report, and which recommendations do you think the London Partnership Board should adopt, and if possible, how should it do it?
So, we were very pleased to undertake the evaluation of the Recovery Board last summer, and it's really nice to see some of the hallmarks from that board and the good things that came through sort of spoken about today. We were mainly undertaking a qualitative evaluation, so one-to-one interviews and a series of focus groups, including one with the Youth Recovery Board, and that was very kind of a very nourishing, interesting exercise. There was a lot of positivity around the whole experience in a very strange and unprecedented time of challenge for London. So I guess some of the key things that we wanted to see come forward include focusing on those big chunky things that need a pan-London response was really important. So some of the things that came up: cost of living, net zero and decarbonisation, structural inequalities, integrated care, decarbonisation of housing and built stock, all those sorts of things. But focusing on some of the issues where people could find common ground and space to find solutions together, rather than issues that would be too divisive to do in that type of forum. I guess the fact that so many institutions have carried on with the Partnership Board and the successes of the Anchor Institutions Network as well is a great example of the value parties are seeing in that. So the other things that we felt would be important, first of all, a city like London of global importance needs a forum for its key institutions and public debate and public partnerships. Partnership is
Sorry,
very
Daniel,
easy
your mic is being a bit, it's playing up a
Is
little
it?
bit, I think.
What are you hearing?
It's going in and out.
Oh, perhaps I'll drag it towards me a bit. Is that any better?
Let's give it a go, sorry.
Yeah? Okay. Right. So sort of focusing on the recommendations. The importance of having a forum for London as a preeminent world city was very important to everybody engaged, and I think that's quite self-evident. Fostering informal and formal relationships across London and partnerships, very much the activities that happen away from the board and the things that it sort of helps to give birth to was seen as very important. A broader canopy for collaborative working was seen as a very important driver to carry on into the Partnership Board, with opportunities to think again and maybe increase the diversity of people and institutions. So, for example, representation from people from LGBTQ+, people who are disabled, were two kind of groups that felt needed to be represented more in that discussion. And diversity around types, certainly there was more space for housing and universities, I think, were some of the groups raised there. Resetting a clear sense of purpose and focus, recognising that the formal structure supported by subgroups and that ripple effect out to institutions and partners and what they do is hugely important, and it sounds like that's happening. Building capacity amongst participants was seen as really important. Some of the best conversations reported to us were you have somebody very much at the top of the NHS dealing with voluntary and community sector organisations that they have very little opportunity to engage with in everyday course of business, and that was a very benevolent and nourishing sort of set of opportunities to get together and work together. But we recognise that there's some asymmetric power and capacity in there that needs sort of support to build real equity. So, for example, the voluntary community sector said they would welcome more support to participate in the board, but also to undertake their role as a representative of that sector away from the board. You're talking about a huge, important and disparate sort of sector of large and small organisations. So there was a lot of pressure on the representatives to report back to that sector. So those are some of the things to think about. Clarity of governance and purpose. Obviously, setting what you're for and what you're not for is really important. And it sounds like some of the things that the board is and isn't are coming to bear. The importance of subgroups and supporting structures, so things can be taken away from the public forum and discussed and dealt with in more detail, is important. More room for interaction, if possible, was a plea from previous members, and recognising the importance of representative mechanisms for young Londoners was seen as really important. Colleague Israel ran the session with the Youth Recovery Board, and they're one of the first groups to smell a fraud, and I think they were really empowered by their involvement in the process, and they didn't feel it was tokenistic but really important. So seeing that youth voice and the future of London come through into new structures, decisions and the things you set in place was seen as really important. So I think there's lots there that seems to harmonise with some of the things we've already heard, and actually sharing some of the learnings as part of capacity building for other boards that you set up was something that was also seen as important.
Thanks. And Luke, I think you've picked up on a lot of the rhetoric around the report already. Is there anything you'd like to add to that in terms of how you've responded to the recommendations or how you are planning to respond to the recommendations?
I think there's a lot that we still need to do about how we work better between the board meetings and how we provide structures and spaces to come together. The issue of how the GLA as the strategic authority supports those sectors which don't have huge organisations around them, civil society is a good example, and how we support them is still an ongoing challenge for us, and I think it's something which I continue to worry about. I continue to think about how we can ensure that there's a meaningful engagement in those at the board and at other levels. Obviously, we've talked about how we've expanded the role and expanded the membership of the board. There's a tension here between how big that board gets and how meaningful that is on a sort of quarterly basis coming together against but making sure you're recognising the full scope of London within it. And again, I think there's something about smaller subgroups and using the approach of the board in existing boards across the GLA and London councils and other places as a kind of template, and that's the role of the team that I have in place to not just to serve as to support the board, but also to be taking that learning and that kind of cultural shift to other parts of the organisation. And then just finally, I mean, it's ensuring that we are communicating back to the board members about and their organisations about what the tangible benefits of being part of it, and there I think the Anchors Institution Network, which many of the board members are actively involved in, feels to me like a sort of tangible exercise that has real very benefits from that network in delivering for communities across London, which grows from the recovery and things we learn from recovery. Having those kind of things as well as part of the board's work programme is hugely important. So it's not just a convening space. There are some tangible programmes and projects that it leads and support. I think that's quite important from the evaluation.
Thank you. I'm going to pass over to Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. If I could ask Luke, first of all, how does the London Partnership Board operational model work? Given that it lacks formal decision-making authority and relies on consensus of participating organisations, how does the London Partnership Board manage dissenting opinions within its decision-making process?
Well, I think the fact that there are dissenting opinions is absolutely bakes into the way that London operates and the way London works, and and understanding that not every member organisation will support every programme, not every borough will have the same priorities, for example, as across all 32 boroughs. Different organisations will absolutely see themselves relevant to some of the discussions of the board and not relevant. So to your point, how do we manage that? We recognise that in a convening space, in a space which isn't about another decision-making structure, that the benefits are around the benefit comes from finding those spaces of agreement and working through them, and that comes, and the way that we do that is through discussions outside the board with board members around their sense of priorities, where they think that us coming together would be successful, and focusing on those things. Now that there is a tension in that, and I absolutely understand it. I guess the question is that the alternative may very well be that we had a board which didn't make progress on any of those challenges if it felt that there had to be consensus around every issue, and there just isn't going to be. So it's accepting that there'll be areas where some people will come with us and some people won't, and that a coalition of the willing around topics is usually very successful, and being open about that and managing it, being transparent.
I noticed that the decisions actually are made by the separate partners, not by the board itself, and they have to be ratified by those separate partners. But is there any kind of veto or anything at all?
No, not at all. I mean, I think it's about helping organisations set and establish their priorities. So, I am sure that when the Mayor came to set his priorities for the budget, the conversations at the board, and you can see that in those themes, come through very strongly. There's certainly no sense of a veto, and I don't think we would get very far with the board members if they felt that board. They have their own accountability structures, they have their own performance, they have that performance data, they have their own boards and their own accountability to ministers or to their own structures. So I think we've never had a situation where we've had someone say they absolutely can't play a part in this. We have had situations where people say, I don't see myself part of that, and that we're not, we won't, there's not something in it for us. We'll focus on another piece of the board's work.
Talking on budgets, do we know what the cost of the LPB is, please?
Well, there's very little cost to the board. I mean, it's staffing costs, and it's about £200,000 is the Strategic Partnerships Board policy and secretariat support. As I say, some of that is about the actual day-to-day running the board. Some of that's about kind of deepening our understanding of partnerships. So the board itself is very in itself isn't a major cost centre for me.
And how is that funded, and how much of that comes from the GLA?
So that core funding, that £200,000, is funded through the GLA's budget. Now, if you talk with Piali or other parts of the board, they have members and teams who support the board's work. So Piali is a very good example. We work very closely with her. She's funded and works for London councils, but a lot of her work is working with us on the development of the board.
And do you have any measures that are able to provide or identify what the value for money is we get out of the LPB?
Well, we'll start with the evaluation. I mean, this was the question, the challenge and the question we had at the Recovery Board, and that's why we commissioned Daniel and his colleagues to help us with that. We're, 11 months into this board. We will do a piece of work after May to understand what, given the context of the election, what the priorities of the board might be. We'll talk to the members about what they want to focus on in the future. And as part of that, we'll continue to talk to them about what's working and what's not working.
Thank you. Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank you. So we've just been hearing, I think this is for Luke and Piali, we've just been hearing how you don't actually have decision-making authority at the Partnership Board and how all that all works. So then how do you ensure that what's been agreed on really is delivered by all the partners, and what metrics have you put in place or do you plan to put in place to measure that delivery?
Different programmes will have different metrics. So as I say, the London Anchors Institution Network has very clear metrics that it delivers against. And
give me an example. Make this sort of real rather than theoretical board and governance discussion. Make it real.
The London Anchors Institution Network has committed to a overall spend of I can't remember the figure off the top of my head of how much of the members' small to medium contracts are let to small to medium size enterprises. They're well on track with that, and they've published the latest figures, 1.75 billion of spend to those. They have a commitment around supporting apprentices, and I think they're at 4,000 now.
Particular.
Yeah. But on other things such as the cost of living crisis, the work of the board. The board doesn't have a set of specific metrics about how it monitors and tracks cost of living. What it's doing is about bringing individual work programmes across organisations together to focus on what the board feels is the priorities for tackling that challenge.
So some of that, it sounds to me as though it's, you're just upskilling all the members and sharing best practice, which there is a value to that, but that's not exactly something you can measure, whereas the example you just gave me felt much more concrete.
That's absolutely true, and there are different elements to different programmes will have different elements. I am sure when we come to the retrofit discussion, there will be very hard metrics across London about what we will have to deliver in terms of retrofit, and that will be for individual organisations within that framework to deliver. But I'm sure that the board will take a close interest in progress on that project. For example.
What happens if a partner is not delivering what they've said they will?
Well, it depends on it depends on the structure of the programme and the project. So, for example, if we felt the partner wasn't engaging and supporting in the Anchors Institution networks where people have signed up to a pledge and a charter and a set of commitments, we'd have a conversation about their continued involvement and membership of that. Back to a conversation around retrofit and the framework around retrofit. I mean, ultimately, we'll have to come up with a programme which has, hard metrics, and people will make commitments to that, and there'll have to be a structure within that for dealing with it. Yeah. I genuinely don't think that the board, and it'd be interesting for other panellists on this. I genuinely don't think that the board would be very successful if it felt that this was a place where the mayor or Georgia Gould and the chairs, or indeed the GLA and London councils, were setting a set of priorities in delivery of hard particular items that people were going to be held accountable to, because they would just say, and we've had this discussion actually, I remember this around the policing board, we had a discussion about kind of not duplicating accountability in other areas, and I think that's a challenge for us.
Yeah, lovely. Piali, have you got anything to add from London councils on this?
Yes, thank you very much. And I've got sort of two different angles on the question. So the first one is a different type of outcome as opposed to a metric. So our housing discussion is really focusing. So we've got a Homes for Londoners board, and we didn't want to duplicate their mandate. So Partnership Board is focusing on making the economic case for housing investment. And what we've done off the back of that is we've commissioned we're going to be jointly commissioning GLA, Trust for London, and us, London councils, some analysis on the connection between housing and productivity. And the outcome we're trying to drive through that work is really probably aimed at the next comprehensive spending review. Yeah. So we can really secure some funding to build more homes in London, the 10 years that we need. So, I can't tell you right now if we're going to be successful or not, but we know from past experience the building blocks to be able to make that case into that comprehensive spending review. So that's one type of example of where we're trying to drive a certain kind of outcome. A second kind of an outcome is next week I have a meeting with one of the youth members of the board who she's got a personal passion about getting people to mentor more, to mentor young people more. She wants to talk to me about how she can kind of mobilize a bit more of a campaign around that. And that might be something that I could see the Partnership Board actually committing to, challenging ourselves to not just mentor, but actually mobilize across our networks a certain number. That might be a way of doing that.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. And James, in your role, observing all of this as a co-opted member, do you, how are you seeing things being implemented are the metrics strong enough, and how do you think different voices are really being heard? What's your take on it all?
So I feel that there are certain outcomes of the board which are very tangible and easy to measure through metrics, and I think Luke's talked about some of that, the thing around London anchor institutions committing a certain amount of their spending on SMEs across the capital. Wonderful thing to be able to do, really easy to measure through metrics. There are other things that the board is achieving which are slightly harder to measure through metrics. I think we can all appreciate that certain indicators around well-being, for example, are slightly more ephemeral, slightly more intangible, and I think in fairness to colleagues, they have worked hard to try and find ways to put a metric around some of this, because of course we want to know that the board is delivering value. We want to know that it's actually doing something. It's not just people coming around and having a nice chat for an hour or whatever and then going off to their roles and nothing comes out of it. And if you think about some of the work that's come out of the London data store, for example, over the last year, that wellbeing measure, for example, there's really clear link there with some of what's been discussed at the board, some of the tangible things that people are talking about, where we can see the difference that the conversations that are happening at the board are having. It's not just this I have not run any lines past colleagues, so forgive me on this, but it's not just a primordial soup from which we are hoping life springs.
Yeah.
There is a kind of science behind what they're trying to do at the board. I hope that's okay to say.
Yeah.
Very happy to primordial soup.
In terms of how diverse voices are heard around the board, I mean, there has been a deliberate attempt to bring in a greater diversity of voice. The fact that you have 2 co-opted members of the Mayor's Equality, Diversity, Inclusion Committee on there is part of that, but of course we can't speak to the full experience of Londoners. I think that if we think about the London Assembly itself and members, we're hoping for a diversity of voices there that represent all of London, but again, we will know that there are areas within there are certain demographics which are less well represented, and so we try to use those opportunities within the subgroups and within the work in between meetings to make sure that we are trying to hear as many voices as possible, to be as inclusive as possible, to listen to the full diversity of London's communities and to feed that into the board. Is it perfect? No, but I don't think any committee ever really achieves a perfect representation of London. I don't think that's a possible thing. But what's important to me is that the board members and that the officers who are working with us from the GLA on the board are open and alive to this issue and are working to make sure that it always remains right at the top of the agenda. I hope that answers your question.
Lovely, thank you, Chair.
Chair, could I make a small point on this, which is just to say, I think, again, from the point of view of an officer who's leading one of the programmes, I think there is kind of hard accountability and soft accountability here. I think, we've discussed this. There are relatively few levers in terms of hard accountability for me to appear before the partnership board and the partnership board to say, you have not done you've not achieved what you said you would achieve. You failed. It is nonetheless, really important, and the Mayor cares and our Deputy Mayors care, and I think from Piali's point of view, borough leaders care, that when we come before the partnership board, we are able to show that we're responding to the priorities that they have set. And critically, thinking about something like retrofit has a tendency to be a discussion between environment and housing professionals. And coming before the partnership board and having to talk to representatives from the equalities and diversity community, representatives of the private sector, representatives from civic society, who are asking you, how are you thinking about our constituents and our communities and the work that you do, really does force a kind of accountability to think broadly around the programmes and the projects for which we're responsible.
Thank you. And Daniel, just quickly, is there anything that you can think is a key to make sure that these strategic decisions and policies are being captured and evaluated in the right way in terms of their success?
Yeah, definitely. I think what happens away from the table is really important, and I guess one mark of whether the partnership is worth it is if partners keep turning up regularly and consistently. So part of the thing that should be tracked is what is the takeaway? What influence do you have into other big structures that are represented on the board over whom you have no delegated authority of what they do, realistically? That ripple effect will be where you find the benefits, and also the abilities to convene and solve problems that aren't solvable individually or on a borough-by-borough basis. Those types of hallmarks will also demonstrate why this is really important.
Thanks. Luke, what is your rough attendance as a percentage, perhaps, of members?
I mean, I'm talking off the top of my head, but I think we're probably pretty close to, I would say, 80%, something like that. I mean, I could get the figures. We push quite hard not to allow substitutions occasionally. There's a good case for that, and we do it. But I mean, it's pretty high. It's not something we spend a lot of time worrying about. And it's in person. I mean, and that is really powerful as well. It's the conversations before and after in person, which I think has is a real benefit to the members. And is there any rules or mechanisms around, say, miss 5 meetings and you're out, or don't turn up for the year and you're out? I don't know if that's happened, but it hasn't happened yet. I think if we got to that point, we'd be having, we'd want a conversation with the individual organisation. Of course, there are different types, and the challenges that James might have in terms of attendance and participating will be very different from the challenges that, I don't know, the chief executive of, the police commissioner, for example. So I think, it's not, I don't think it's a hard or fast rule. We'd want to understand why they weren't attending. But I think we're quite some way from that now. Thanks. Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you. I'm moving us on to look at sort of operations of the LPB. And I understand that the sort of main things on the work plan were housing and investment in London, unlocking opportunities for young Londoners and vulnerable groups, and tackling the cost of living. So I'm just wondering, what were the key considerations in setting those priorities for the work plan for 23-24? Luke, you look like you're getting ready to answer. And I'll come to you online afterwards, Piali.
Well, let me give sort of the basic bureaucratic answer, which is that the organisation, the board, when it came together in March last year, it set up a smaller group of members, supported by quite a big piece of data work from the City Intelligence Unit, which I'm pretty sure it was published online, looking at where the big challenges and issues are. There was a conversation with that group about where they felt the most valuable, and they set the work programme. It was done in the context of the conversation that we had together here a year ago about kind of avoiding duplication and avoiding spaces where there are better places for a conversation to go, and similarly kind of the areas where we thought there would be the widest sense of consensus and the widest sense of progress, and that group came together and set the programme, and that's kind of how we went about it.
Piali, do you want to add anything on that?
Yes, please. Thank you very much for the opportunity. So just to drill down on one of those themes, with the housing one in particular, we convened a bit of a task and finish group, and it really was a task and finish, not one of the ones that sort of goes on for months and months. It was a bit of a SWAT team where we pulled together a range of perspectives on housing, and just thought, okay, so how do we add the most value? There's a ton of stuff going on across London on housing. So how is this board going to add the most value and not duplicate that? And that's when we realized that nobody was really looking at the link between housing and productivity, and particularly economic growth. And that's where we could add the most value, because that part of the story wasn't being told for London. And then we disbanded, and they made that recommendation into the board. And then what we've done since is, between us and the G15 and the GLA, and then partners who volunteered because they saw themselves as having a role in that have come forward and helped us think through what the actions for that might be. So in particular, the research that we're commissioning, that's going to be the pivotal piece.
So and what, can you just again make this real? What are the actions coming out of that? I mean, that kind of, so you've identified the link between housing and productivity, identified that that's something that, across London strategically we need to be thinking about. So what are the actions that come out of that?
So that's the flagship piece right now, just to get the analysis itself, so we're able to make that case to government about why there needs to be more investment into building homes in London. But the other elements have been actually just surfacing the issues so that we make sure that people understand that actually London's housing crisis is holding back our economic growth. And so different members of the board are now telling that bit of that story using their own case study. So what we've done is given them the framework for the story to tell. So for example, the Chamber is now talking to, like I said, the business secretary to talk about the data they're collecting from their members on the challenges in recruitment and retention related to not having affordable housing. Similarly, the NHS, Caroline Clark is having that conversation back into NHS England about both the impacts of poor housing in London on what they see in terms of the demand for healthcare services. Actually, similarly, the need, what the need for agency workers is doing to the NHS pay bill in London because people can't afford to live here. So different angles, and that's what we decided out of that board is actually we need to keep this on the radar of ministers for whom all of our homelessness stats just aren't cutting through right now. So we need to come at it from an economic growth angle, and partners now have a clearer sense about how to pull their own case studies, employee survey data, that kind of thing, back into their individual interactions with decision makers while we do the collective piece around investment.
Mm-hmm. So it's about having that kind of strategic overview, looking at kind of using data to raise up issues that also help you make the case to government for funding.
Exactly right, and really just get that hearing in government. Yeah.
Okay, and in terms of the way that progress is being measured and communicated to LPB members, particularly looking at the recovery missions, which I think are they still exist as a thing, am I right? So perhaps Piali and then Bruce could just address sort of how you're measuring the progress against the recovery missions and how that's being reported at the board.
We report back in a written report form about the progress against the missions. They haven't, if I'm very honest, been the focus of a lot of discussion at the board, because the three priorities do link to the recovery missions, and that's where the bulk of the discussion at the board happens. But we don't necessarily sit and kind of go through all of the missions together as a board. We haven't really done that. It's something that we might want to consider, Luke, at some point, but that's not really where the board has wanted to spend its time, is kind of going through the breadth of the missions and getting a report back on. We do kind of bring papers back to do that and discuss it on a, people can comment on those papers.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things that has come up frequently this morning is the risk in terms of retrofit, which obviously is both a sort of economy issue, because the lack of progress on retrofit means that there's jobs that just aren't being created that could be being created, but also we have homes that are leaky, uncomfortable to live in, expensive to live in, and that with the cost of living crisis is also a big risk. So I've been hearing loud and clear, sort of peppered through the meeting, is the risk related to retrofit. On the missions and foundations dashboard, there's a lot of red around retrofit. It's obviously something that you're thinking about, and things have been moved from risks to issues, but the issues are flashing red as high. And I suspect that may be because they're becoming issues rather than risks to the partnership board, because you don't have control over the money for that. Is that right? Phil, do you want to?
In large part, yes, that's right. One of the biggest, perhaps the single biggest challenge we have. Well, no, I wouldn't say the single biggest, but there are a whole set of challenges. But if we can't get sufficient funding, then it's going to be very difficult to deliver retrofit at the scale that London is looking at. So that has moved that up into an issue. I think alongside that, which has been recognised in the programme of work that Piali's been referred to, around a more cross-London system approach to retrofit, is also a recognition that whatever funding we might require from government, and I think it's certainly higher than what we have received over recent years, it won't be enough, and we need to more effectively deploy private finance in all kinds of forms to support that. But we don't have a shared London structure to do that yet. So the conversation with the private sector is fragmented and uncertain. There are then a whole set of other issues around supply chain, around skills, around procurement, where more coordination could help reduce costs and accelerate progress. So I think in terms of the transition from the Green New Deal mission, as we transitioned from the Recovery Board into the Partnership Board, I think it reflects the conversation we've been having about the desire for the Partnership Board to really focus. So the Recovery Board and the Green New Deal mission has driven a lot of better partnership working around individual work streams. And for example, in terms of delivering the next round of Warmer Homes, the Hug 2 money that we've received, we're working much more effectively with London councils and the boroughs to reflect homes. But I think the Partnership Board is now saying, well, what's the big question we need to solve? And the big question is getting the structures right, in order to be able to make the case to government that if they were to provide us with more funding, we would be in a position to deploy it effectively, and to engage outwards to the private sector, to the investment community, and actually to communities as well, effectively, around the case for retrofit and how we can deliver it most effectively.
And do you have a timescale for getting those structures into the right shape in order to be able to do it?
We are coming back to the next meeting of the Partnership Board with the report from the research project that we have been working on with the joint steering group between London councils, the GLA and the G15 in that, and as an advisory body, and that is going to set some of that out and make some recommendations around a way forward, but that's still just in the process of being finalised.
And sorry, when's that meeting date?
Next month.
Next month. So, okay, so then that will be public at that point?
That will become public at that point.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. I know you wanted to... Could I just finish one question to James and then I'm done?
Yes, it was just before we move.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
If that's okay, but finish up.
Yeah. So, James, I just wanted to get a sense from you in terms of the Partnership Board and kind of, sort of the kind of its work programme and its delivery on its work programme. Do you feel that the voices of disabled Londoners are well represented in, I mean, I'm not saying are you representing them well, are you feeling that it is possible for the concerns and interests of disabled Londoners to be heard within the Partnership Board? And can you give any examples of ways in which you think that that's actually been heard and made a difference?
In a word, yes, but with lots of qualifications around that. So you said this isn't a reflection on me, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that I can't possibly speak for every disabled Londoner, and there's a recognition that we need to consult far more widely. I'm there to be a kind of a helpful nudge in the right direction, but this work particularly, which has impacts upon disabled Londoners who, as we know, already face so many significant challenges to accessing suitable accommodation, needs to be consulted upon far more widely and to involve a much wider cross-section of London's communities. There has been opportunity for colleagues across the GLA stemming from the partnership board and filtering down into other areas of work across the GLA. I think in particular the work that Phil leads on, for colleagues to work with various communities and their representatives. If I think about ways, trying to give you an example, so there is a DDPO forum, so a Deaf and Disabled People's Organisations forum, which brings together a significant number of London's DDPOs, which represent a better cross-section of Londoners than I possibly can as an individual. And they've had a good opportunity and significant access to GLA officers to inform some of the work, particularly around retrofit, but also more broadly across the GLA's other equality areas and areas of work delivery. As a disabled Londoner myself, I would of course love to see much, much more interaction. Of course I would. I would love to see DDPOs working more closely with the GLA. I would love to see deaf and disabled people's organisations having even greater access to officers than they currently do. But that said, I do feel that there is a sufficiently strong avenue for them to communicate and to challenge decisions being made at the GLA. But that's just my opinion. Obviously, I'm biased.
Okay, so we'll be watching this space for how deaf and disabled people's opinions are included. I think it
absolutely
feels like something important to keep track of. Bruce.
Absolutely. Sorry,
Luke.
Sorry, could I just jump in with one more thing? I mean, I can give you a very tangible example involving Assembly members. I know that sort of the chair was part of a group where we heard from an organisation called CLADAG, who are challenging the government around the unfair, unlawful, potentially, evacuation plans that are in place for disabled people when it comes to emergency evacuation situations. And so I think that shows that, disabled people's voices are being heard by officers, by Assembly members throughout the work that the GLA does.
Thank you. And sorry, Luke, you wanted to...
I mean, I just think what James is talking about is part of the power of the partnership board, in the sense that if you get, James is absolutely right about the limits that any one of the people around the board, but particularly those who are trying to represent very diverse, very wide communities with very different interests, that is a huge challenge. But if you at least get to the point where, as you're establishing these big challenges and tackling those big challenges with the members of the board, and at that point you are saying there is an impact on this group, this voice needs to be heard, these issues are really important, and you're starting from that place, that feeds down to the work that will happen across those organisations. So, as Phil said on retrofit, it's often a conversation between professionals with very kind of specific experience and knowledge who may not have the exposure to the sort of things that James has just been talking about. So if you set that expectation at the start and that kind of cultural partnership approach, when you at that level, that's really, I think, much more to do and all the rest of it, but is very powerful.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Assembly Member DeVal.
Just going back to about setting priorities and how quickly you can adapt on one of those issues, and I don't want to take away from some of the good work that you've done and some of those individual items that you've explained to us this morning, but it just seems to me there are some big issues here that need addressing and where we've lost our way in London, and your partnership body probably brings people together where they can be addressed in a apolitical way, but an important way. So the case for London. So we're on the verge of a general election, and there may be a change of government, there may not be, but I'm not clear we're the powerful voice of all your partners coming together, explaining about the needs for London. What I am clear is what's happening outside London, where they're all saying that it feels like we're under attack, when some of the issues that are faced by your partners and collectively we could start preparing the case. It's those feds, whoever's in power, aren't always generous around or fairness in terms of the allocation of those resources. But unless we make those arguments, I don't see those. So where are we? I know from March you've relaunched and you're doing some really worthy things, but an immediate priority must be making that case for London for your various partners, because it's actually a case for us all in some ways.
Well, I entirely agree with that, Assembly Member. I mean, I would point to, firstly, very specific pieces of work. So, for example, on housing and the productivity, that's making the case for London. That's coming together to say that, the impact of us not resolving the housing problem in London isn't just about the blighted lives and all the rest of it. It's also about the kind of the impact it has on the UK's economy. And so, I'd point to that. I'd also point to the levelling up work, the levelling up advisory council work. Now, that's the tool that the government has chosen to engage with London through the levelling up conversation. There's a huge piece of work going on around establishing the base case, which I think what you're talking about, to support that, and that's been a conversation a number of times at the board. I think there is a challenge about the extent to which we've provided a lot of data through the board. We've provided a data pack. We have a lot of the material that we produce through the City Intelligence Unit onto the data store is about trying to make that case. I guess the issue is how far we feel that we are able to come together on a very single common script that may end up not being impactful enough because of the diversity of the issues. Or are we saying that these are the areas where we think that the board members can make a real impact and they can go and push it? But I definitely think that listening to you now, definitely as we come back, that making the case for London is something that the board should be should continue to do and find a way in doing it which is builds a consensus in an impactful way. So I agree with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you. We're moving on to a new section which is looking at subgroups of the Partnership Board. And I'm going to start with Luke and then come to Daniel. So, Luke, the London Partnerships Youth Board, so this is another sort of important voice of Londoners that we know the GLA makes an effort to hear from young people, which is great. But how does the London Partnerships Youth Board contribute to the London Partnerships Board work, and what was the response to the Youth Board's recommendations, particularly in the areas of housing and the cost of living?
Well, let's take the first of those and then I'll come to the second. The Youth Board, which is drawn from a number of different already represented bodies across the GLA and other partners, comes together on, I think it's a monthly basis, but frequently comes together supported by officers in my teams to look at the papers, to help with the agenda setting, to make comments. They are leading a discussion at the next partnership board, so we have given over time to them to help to set the agenda and to talk through their, in this case, skills issues that they think that is not being taken seriously enough. They we provide them with kind of officer support to help them engage with individual teams within the GLA and London councils and others, so they've got access to expertise and that they can feel that they can talk with the people drafting the papers and drafting and working on the issues. So that's the that's the way we work with the board. And sorry, I've forgotten your second part of your question.
The second part was, what was the response to Youth Board recommendations, particularly in the areas of housing and the cost of living?
Yeah, so I mean, on the housing issue, there was the focus on the impact on their careers and their lives, which I think is seen in the productivity work, came through very strongly. They argued both about the importance of how much of their lives and their times are their time is impacted on poor housing conditions and on rent, and the importance of having access to a wider stock of housing came through very strongly. So I think that is reflected in the work programme we have on housing, and their testimony at the board, I think, was regarded hugely powerfully by the members.
Thank you. Daniel, just in terms of what you learned through the process of evaluating the London Recovery Board programme and the kind of the recommendations that you made to shape the development of the London Partnership Board, can you give us any examples of ways that the voices of young people were incorporated in that work?
So for our evaluation, we had Israel, who's a younger member of our team, run a session with the Youth Board to talk specifically about their experiences and needs, and the involvement of the Youth Board was also considered in the wider conversations with others. Overall, as sort of set out in more detail in last summer's report, there was quite strong positive experiences of all of that. As I mentioned before, they felt they were able to participate with some genuine equity, obviously with very specific need for more support around those conversations as well. I think they took different turns, sort of sitting between the Youth Board and the main board, and certainly some of the issues that came through, as you've mentioned, are being addressed. I think another key issue is access to spaces and places and things to do, which is it's still a key challenge for London. So I think the fact that the Youth Board element is carrying through is a very positive thing. I probably couldn't comment more on where the Partnership Board is with that, other than what I've heard today, though.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you. Put my questions to Luke to start with, and this is around the levelling up bit of the work. How does the London Partnership Board operate as the local partnership group for the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and what elements are overseen by that subgroup?
If I might, I think Phil's probably better placed.
Okay, fine.
Better place, yes, because it's administered by the Economic Development and Programmes Unit in my directorate. And essentially, the London Partnership Board has there's two levels at which the London Partnership Board interacts with UK SPF. So the first of which is that for UK SPF as a whole, the government requires any what they call administering authority, lead authority, to have some kind of local partnership group, which is the phrase that they use, to provide advice and guidance. It's not a decision-making body, but to steer decisions around how UK SPF allocations as a whole are utilised. And the government, when it provided its initial guidance on UK SPF, had a long list of who should be on that local partnership group, which almost entirely overlapped with the members of the London Partnership Board. It was private sector, it was civil society, it was the broader, the different tiers of the public sector with strong political leadership and so on. So there was a really good overlap. I think there was another reason why we asked the London Partnership Board to play that role, however, which was not simply that it happened to have the right people on it, but that we wanted that local partnership group to be providing advice and considering the use of UK SPF from the point of view of a really good understanding of London as a whole, and in a world, coming back to, I think, the Chair's comments, in which, I'd say it there's a really good reason for people to turn up to the meetings and to keep things going. And, you know, the fact that that discussion around UKSPF is sat within a broader strategic overview of London, I think has made it very powerful. And I think the structures for how we use UK SPF, which are very different from how we have utilised the previous rounds of European funding, which were almost entirely allocated by competitive bidding processes. But actually we've been able to look strategically with the boroughs and other partners at how this is deployed, I think is a big step forward and reflects the impact of was probably still the recovery board at the point at which we've began that process, but certainly by the time we finalised it, it had moved across. So it has a role as a strategic oversight and strategic guidance, but then we were keen to ensure, particularly for those elements that were being run through competitive bidding, that there was some kind of sort of external consideration of the decisions that were being taken by my team, and often in discussion with the boroughs as well, to make sure that those were seen as well evidenced and were seen as reflecting the wider priorities of London. And this is very similar to the way in which we worked with the European programmes, where we had what was called ESIF, and please don't ask me to remember what ESIF stood for.
European Structural and Investment Fund.
There you go. Thank you. It's lucky you're here. But that provided the sort of the detailed consideration of sort of allocation decisions, and then the London Economic Action Partnership, the LEAP, provided the strategic overview. So that subcommittee has reviewed and challenged, and I think their discussions led to some changes in allocations when the 30 million open call allocations were finalised, but it will also support the London Partnership Board in its more strategic role by bringing an annual report on how UK SPF is being utilised and what it's delivering. It provided the first of those in the summer this year, but that was really was more of a process update, because we were still at a point in the process where it was really about getting allocations agreed and out of the door. I think by the time it brings its second report later this year, it will probably have more to report in terms of impact on the ground.
Good. So hopefully you'd have agreed shared priorities that are deliverable and will have a real impact. But what were your key priorities that were agreed in the partnership?
So the critical priorities that were agreed by the partnership were, first of all, around an approach to using the communities and place strand, which set priorities for boroughs around support. I mean, it's what you would think around supporting diverse communities, around delivering new public realm, around creating new community assets, but then to achieve those through allocation to boroughs through an allocation methodology that was set not by us in the GLA but by London councils across the 33 boroughs. And then with regard to the supporting business strand, which is the largest allocation as we have set it up, again, to look at a strategic approach to deploying that, which was focused on creating a sort of a single front door for business support that went from supporting high growth businesses at the top end through cross London support for small and medium enterprises, and then down to borough-led sort of community outreach to ensure that local businesses were able to access that support. And there have been a set of outcomes set for L&P who coordinate that work in terms of delivering that. So at the global scale, in what's called Grow London Global, which is the high growth end, they are expected to achieve at least 560 businesses receiving support and to create at least 600 jobs. and to have more than 200 businesses engaged in new international markets at the local level. Through Grow London Local, which is our single front door on the web, and then through the Wayfinder programme, which provides local outreach and support to businesses. We're expecting to reach at least 12,000 businesses. So we've been quite clear about the outcomes, the outputs that we're expecting to deliver through that work.
Thank you. Now, obviously, when we had Brexit and we knew ESIF monies were going to stop, the Levelling Up Fund, the UK Prosperity Fund, the government said it was going to be of equal value. In fact, it's half the value that was promised. So I've got two questions. Has that proved difficult, and what could you do if we did actually have the money that was promised? But secondly, this funding is only guaranteed to 25 and there's a cliff edge. Has the partnership given any thought to what case you're going to make, or a plan B?
In relation to your first question, and the fact that the money was reducing so significantly was at the heart of the recognition by the Partnership Board and by the GLA and by the boroughs that we need to deploy it more strategically and not simply allow it to be sort of very, I'm trying to think of the right word, but sort of disparately spread about through competitive bidding. We needed to think about how it could deliver more effective structures to support business rather than simply individual programmes. So that was very much at the forefront of our thinking. Undoubtedly, if we had more money, we could both increase the scale of the open call element of the programme, and we could increase the number of outreach workers we are providing. We could increase the amount of marketing we're providing to support businesses. We could run more international trade delegations. We could run more support programs for high growth businesses. We could do more. I think the change in approach means, I hope, that we're getting more than half of the benefit out of half of the money, but we're certainly not magically managing to achieve twice as much per pound as we might have in other circumstances. In terms of the discussion about what happens post 2025, I have to admit we have begun that conversation internally. We haven't had that conversation with the Partnership Board yet, but I would imagine that when the subgroup comes to make their next annual progress report, that's going to be one of the questions that they are going to want to raise, and that will be part of the discussion that we'll have with board members when that comes later this year.
Good. I think that goes to Assemblymember Duval's question about making that case.
Absolutely, and making the case, yes, absolutely. And I think it's, if I may come back to that question very briefly, and going back to the Recovery Board, one of the things that the Recovery Board did really effectively was reshape the way in which the different parts of London work together on economic recovery and now on economic development. And in many ways that's now sort of moved beyond the Partnership Board. It's become part of business as usual, but it has led to the establishment, for example, of Opportunity London, which is making the case for investment in London's built environment, and is about to launch London's first ever cross-London investment prospectus next week, to work on a shared infrastructure framework across the GLA, the boroughs and the private sector. So we've got a really clear view into government as to what investment we need in our infrastructure and so on. What I think we haven't done yet, which is exactly what Assemblymember Duval is saying, is quite got to the point with the Partnership Board where we've pulled all of that activity into a single really compelling narrative.
Thank you. And my final question is on the London Anchors Institution network. So, Luke, you've nodded at me. So this is for you. So how does Lane ensure that its initiatives and focus areas align with the strategic priorities of the London Partnership Board? And can you provide any examples where their work has directly contributed to the board's goals and objectives?
So very much Lane was born out of the Recovery Board and the desire and understanding that that for the resilience of the city in its broadest terms, you needed to have a programme which looked at how you supported local communities and how the impact of big organisations, TfL and others, are using their not very significant buying and employment power locally and support, and that is part of our response from. So it's born out of that period. I mean, on a very basic level, the two chairs of the Lane sit on the recovery board, so Professor Wendy Thompson and Martin McRae for NHS. They have been very strong advocates for this programme, and put on record my thanks to them for their huge support for it. They report, they come back, they have the discussion. I think if you looked in there, it's important that the Lane programme focuses on what anchors can do, that it doesn't just suddenly become a sort of delivery network for every good idea that people have. And I think there is keeping it prioritised to the things that an anchor institution network can do is really important to me and to the team that run it, because as I say, it would become quite disparate. In focusing on small and medium-sized enterprises and opportunities for those from a background who haven't been able to access those opportunities in the past, it plays very strongly to the sense of tackling the long-term structural inequalities within the city, and that is a part of that programme there, which definitely was in recovery and has continued to be a part of the board's work. If you think about upskilling staff around climate change mitigation actions, I think 5,000 of them happened. Well, that clearly plays to the prioritisation around climate change and tackling climate change. So it is very much born of that work. It has a separate identity because the concept of anchors is separate. But there's a very close linkage between, both in terms of its delivery, but also in the way it works and thinks about its work and engages with the board. And I do commend that piece of work to the Assembly. I think looking at that impact report and what can be achieved, I'm told by Bloomberg, who've done a lot of consulting work for us on this, that this is now the best example around the world of a city coming together to use its powers to deliver as anchors. And there's been lots of attempts at this, and this feels like it's gone further than others. So it's a really strong piece of work, but rooted in that board.
Good, thank you, Chair.
I think there's a very particular point about the anchors, certainly for me, going back to the very genesis of it, which is that it was not a programme that came out either of the GLA or the boroughs that we took to the board and said, can we get your agreement to this? The anchors, the partnership, the recovery board and the partnership board was not operating as a kind of convening structure for us to get agreement. It was David Sloman in NHS England who came to the partnership board and said, we want to work in a different way. We would like other organisations to work in that way with us. And the GLA said, well, what can we do to support you? But I think it's a really powerful example of how different things happened because we brought that wider partnership together than would have been the case if it was simply sort of the core public sector of London, the GLA and the boroughs, sort of thinking about what their priorities ought to be and trying to bring people along with them.
Thank you. I just wanted to come back to a couple of points Assembly Member McCartney was raising around the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which obviously is a £2.6 billion fund across the UK. The specific arguments, however, in relation to our funding, they're localised. So I think it's just we want to make sure that we make that point. And I think it's what Assembly Member Val was speaking to earlier. It's making that case for London and London's allocations as opposed to the grant itself, which is actually more money for the UK. But there is a specific part of that that is new. I mean, the cliff edge is something that's always existed and actually could have been designed out perhaps, but wasn't. But it did used to exist. But the new thing we have now is this involvement of the local authorities. And is the partnership board helping local authorities in realising their power now with the UK Shared Prosperity Fund? And perhaps, James, did you want to take that? Because I know you have done some work on that. Or Luke, I don't know.
Piali, maybe. the others as well.
I can give you the relatively uninformed opinion on this one, and then I'll defer to colleagues for the more informed take. I think UK SPF is a really neat example in which we can see a kind of crystallisation of the value of the London Partnership Board around this. And sorry, Chair, I will come around to the point, but I just wanted to make a few contextual points around that first. So we spoke about dissenting voices earlier. We spoke about the importance of hearing disabled voices in the process. The distribution of UK SPF through the London Partnership Board, with having that kind of informing view, has been really powerful. I've been one of those dissenting voices on the London Partnership Board, talking about the way in which we are designing UK SPF, and that's been listened to by colleagues. We spoke earlier about making that apolitical argument for a greater share for Londoners. And again, I think that's a really neat example where you can see UK SPF being one of those issues which is really easy to measure to make that case. If I think about the advice to local authorities that has gone from the board, that's one I'll have to defer to colleagues, I'm afraid, to answer. It's one I'm not as close to. But I think the point that I did want to make is that the London Partnership Board, being the structure which has that handle on UK SPF, has allowed for a greater diversity of voices to inform the way in which it's distributed than perhaps otherwise would have been. And for me, that's been the value of it. But I'll defer to others.
Thanks. I think maybe I'll come to Piali first online, if that's okay. How do you think the board's helped empower local authorities with that decision-making power they now have around the UK Shared Prosperity Fund?
I think, just to clarify, I think the key difference is actually the allocated part of that it was allocated as opposed to competed. That's the big difference, because boroughs did have a role in delivering European structural funds before, but they'd have to compete for them. I think the really big thing is actually thinking about, the advice has been to actually, how do we leverage that funding with other sources of funding? So as an example, in London, boroughs have been delegated through the sub-regional partnerships that exist, the four of them, that work in health program that the DWP operate. And London is one of the only cities where that's delegated in the UK. And boroughs have really been thinking about how to combine that funding with the UK SPF funding that they receive, particularly around the people who are most disadvantaged when it comes to the labour market, who often need a much more wide range of support to join the labour market. So rather than taking a very purist view about what you might do with either of those pots of money, actually thinking about how to combine those pots of money to actually unlock that range of support that you need to help people join the labour market and stay in it. That's one of those examples.
Thank you. Was there anything you particularly wanted to add to that, or would be good to move on? Cool. Okay, thanks. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Lovely. Yeah, I was going to ask about measuring impact, but actually you've already given a good example on that, so I don't think we need to cover that. Just wondering, perhaps Piali and Luke, you could just briefly tell me what your priorities are going to be beyond 2024 and that future activity work.
So I think, well, I mean, there's clearly a set of ongoing priorities which we already have, which will continue, I would expect, in a beyond May. So we will continue, I would hope, with Lane. We'll continue with the focus on inequalities. We'll continue on the focus around bringing in diverse voices. The youth board, I think they will be priorities. We're setting the agenda for the first meeting after the May election. We haven't yet brought people together to think about what their longer term priorities would be. It seems right to set those as a partnership board in the context of an election outcome.
Yeah, and whoever's mayor and co-chair, you understand. So that work is on pause, but will happen May, June.
Absolutely, definitely.
Yeah,
I mean,
makes sense.
I'm not sure it's on. I wouldn't describe it as on pause. I'd just say, we have a substantive piece of work ongoing. Yeah. We will come to it at the point where we think it's probably the best to do it, and that's in the context.
Drill down and focus and say, okay, this is where you know, that steerer, of course, makes sense.
You know, it's an election. You know, we're in the hands of the manifesto writers about whether people will wish to continue with this piece of work, and that also, you know, I think we need to be realistic.
Lovely. And Piali, have you got anything to add or?
I do, if you don't mind. I won't take up too much time, but we're about to take a paper to our own leaders committee next week, so it's fair enough for me to say this because it should be public today. Is we're asking leaders if they would like us to propose to the board that next year we mobilise around a campaign to end homelessness in London. We spent a lot of time in London and a lot of national resource talking about rough sleeping, but homelessness goes well beyond that. We are the absolute epicenter of homelessness in this country, and it's becoming a national crisis, our crisis. So that's one of the things that our borough leaders potentially will be looking to propose to the board is, could we mobilize across, you know, all partners in the city around that issue. The other two things I had was, I'd like to kind of explore what other cities are doing. So other cities also have boards like ours, and I'd like to just understand what they're doing a little bit better, just to see if there's anything we could learn from those. So I was speaking to the Chief Executive of Sheffield City Council last night, and there's some really interesting stuff that they're doing with their young people around the city that we should be building for our young, you know, that they want to be building for their young people. So that's another angle that we might want to consider bringing back to the partnership board, is what else is happening in the UK. And then finally, I think, going back to Member Duval's point, I think there's a really important point for us to register about London that people don't always understand in the national landscape, which is they think our roads are paved with gold. So I think there's a really tricky balanced story for us to tell about. London is absolutely the engine of the UK's economy, but we are also, you know, home to some of the most deprived communities. So, you know, when it comes to levelling up or whatever that agenda might be called, London absolutely needs to be core part of that agenda. And I think we need to think of different ways of telling that story, that we're part of the growth agenda, but we're also part of the inequality agenda and solving that.
Yeah, I think we've always, whichever party's been in government, struggled to make that case, and we might all agree with exactly what you're saying. It's how we communicate it in a way that actually hits home with those. And I think using data smartly, and that might be part of your work. I think other cities, New York, use data in a way that we certainly are only scratching the surface, and that might be something that would fit in with your work. Luke, you just want to add something?
Well, I think it's also... I absolutely agree with the data point, by the way, and I think that we're making some progress, but you're right, the examples of other cities, New York is very
way ahead of the game.
Yeah, indeed. There's also something about who carries the message, and one of the things we certainly worked out through COVID and then into recovery was that different partners, you know, were able to speak on an issue in a way that landed better than others, or in a way which resonated better than others. And, you know, working with some borough leaders, for example, Councillor Campbell, for example, in Kensington Chelsea, was able to have a really good conversation about skills, which amplified the London challenges with ministers and with government in a way which perhaps sometimes GLA officers find more difficult. So it's not just about the message; it's working together to get the right person. We know that John Dickey and colleagues at London First, have a very strong, very well respected, have a very strong voice, and working with them to deliver it.
It's called Business London now, but
Business London,
can correct that in the minutes, I'm sure.
He'll kill me. Thank you. Business London are very strong carriers for that message.
That's right. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Duval.
Thank you. And just going on that, and just to repeat, I suppose, what Piali was saying, not just learning from other cities in the UK, but there are international issues. And I think, just stepping back, and it's made me think this morning, the complexity of what we're trying to achieve here is probably greater than any other, I think, international city partnerships that I've seen. But it's worth still learning lessons from others of how they grapple with things. Now, of course, and we've covered this, we've talked about the impacts of your work, and we've talked about, okay, you've had the relaunch in March. So tell me, internally, has the partnership talked about the self-improvement agenda of how it assesses its external impact on others? In terms of that, what's the thinking around that? How are you measuring that as you make the case of why you're all coming together to do something? Well, you're doing many things. So tell me about what the thinking is around that and how you're engaging, or what you think the future engagement of stakeholders looks like, those at the partnership level, but those who may be on the fringes but impacted by your work.
So I think there are three layers to that answer. I mean, the first, we've already had Daniel talking about the evaluation. I think, given the kind of this is not a board which typically operates within the GLA. It is new. Continuing to work with Daniel and his colleagues, or other consultancies as we might, but working with some outside challenge and some outside support. And just as we were starting this conversation before as we came in, Daniel and I were talking about kind of the experience that he was having across London of partners wanting to do something similar. So there's definitely some outside challenges and support. I think there's definitely and that's part of the point of the strategic partnerships team, which was set up to support this, managing the board, but also working with Piali, with Phil and other colleagues across the organisations, and with colleagues in civil society, with James, about kind of how they, what we've learnt and what best practices. And I can absolutely see, and I think I gave the example at the start, but the way we are now talking about skills, for example, and the way we're now talking about housing at the GLA and across partnerships has changed fundamentally. Well, not fundamentally, but it's changed very significantly, because the GLA can see, and GLA officers can see, how a partnership focus and a partnership approach. So there's something about us having a centre of expertise within the strategic partnerships team who are helping the organisation come together and to understand that. I guess the final part for me is the conversation we had with the board itself about what they feel where the value is, and how they can not just set the priorities, because on one hand that's a relatively easy task to do. You use data, we do things, but kind of like what is the value add, and constantly reminding ourselves about kind of where we can help and where we should just stay out of it and not duplicate action elsewhere and just kind of end up in a bit of a blancmange. So Assembly Member, I place it on those kind of three levels. Okay. And one of the things that I would tend to base on your successes is who advocates for who. So when higher education advocates for our colleagues in local government on the skills agenda, I'd want to see more of that. I want to see, this is not, as I see it, a creature of the mayor. This is a creature of London's development, which the mayor is sharing with other institutions and other stakeholders in London about the London agenda of improvement and going forward. Is that where? This conversation, so I absolutely can see that. So, for example, London Hire has talked about its wider interest in skills development across the city, and has carried that London message. Diana Beach, who's the chief executive of that organisation, is a very active member of the board and participates well beyond just her own set of interests. I guess what this conversation is leading me to think about, which is how do you capture that and demonstrate it, because it's quite a qualitative thing, right? And and how do you work with very significant figures to get them to report on how they've done it? And I need to think about that, but I do think you're absolutely right. Demonstrating different partners across London, Lancashire Institution I'll come back to is a very good example of that in action, but how different partners across London advocate for each other is the core strength of it. I think it does happen. I'm struggling a bit, and I think your challenge is absolutely right, Assembly Member, about how we demonstrate that, and in demonstrating it, therefore, you're demonstrating the value of it. Thank you. Okay, let's go on to the current tracking mechanisms and your future plans. So what do they look like? Or is it too early because you've got an agenda, post-recovery, you're sticking with that? Where is the future plans come? How
How do I commission something from sitting here in the little old assembly if we all collectively thought the London Partnership body should be doing something, and you might be missing a point? What's the mechanisms in, or do I have to have a place on the board, or do I have to be the mayor, executive mayor, because I'll get my pound of flesh, I'm paying for it, I want a bit back? What do I do?
Well, I certainly don't think you need to be the mayor. I mean, just on the basics, I think the conversation that I had with Assemblyman Pigeonoli about kind of where would be the right time to input, which is around post the election, looking at the priorities of the new administration, which will place clearly a framing thing. But I absolutely think that and I know that our team, both in terms of the direct response from you to these kinds of sessions, but also more broadly look at what the Assembly are focusing on and the issues you're focusing on, and that forms part of the discussion around the priorities for London. I mean, I think, let me give you an example of that. I think when we met going back over a year ago, it may even be a meeting prior to that, I think Assembly members pushed very strongly at where was housing in all of this, and it wasn't, frankly, there. Now I think you can see housing very strongly in it, but the Assembly has a number of mechanisms which it can both formal and informal, and I'd be very keen to engage with whether this committee or others on what the priorities are, and either, as I say, informally or formally. But I think that you have already influenced it. I think you'll continue to. I don't know about the kind of exactly how we'll pick that up after May, but that will be the point to do it.
Okay, and just finally, Chair, just a question. Let's talk about government relationships, regardless of who's in power. So, but let's use the past. How is the Minister for London, whoever it is this week, liaising with your group or aware of the work that you're doing around that, not just in a lobbying, but because we know partnership work extends between national, regional, we're not allowed to call it that, strategic then, and local, and to make things happen. So how does your relationships with government work, if you could paint some pictures for us?
Well, perhaps if I give a broad answer, and it may be that Piali and Phil and other colleagues might want to give some specifics. But firstly, the Minister of London is a member of the Partnership Board. Paul Scully in the past, when he was minister, was an active member. He turned up, he contributed, he supported. His official and the mayor and Georgia Gould, Councillor Gould, have had a letter from Greg Hands saying that he wishes to continue to be a member and wishes to play a part in that. That's a symbol. That's important. And certainly Paul Scully, it's a bit too early with the current minister. We haven't, as I say, I don't think he's only recently been appointed. But Paul Scully used the Partnership Board and used his role as the London minister to help bring people together to have discussions. And I think Skills was a good example. I think. But then you've got the layer below that, and I think when I talk to civil servants who work on London challenges, they first of all they draw a lot of comfort from the Partnership Board because they can feel that there's a space where they can go to and they can look at the minutes, they can look at the meetings, and they can see that London talking with one voice. They attend senior officials of responsibility for London attend the board either in person or online, and we have a conversation, ongoing dialogue and conversation. It feels to me like not I mean for the GLA particularly, but for all of the partners, the Partnership Board gives more of a permission to work with officials and work with them, so they don't, it decomplicates it for them a bit. I mean, it's still pretty complicated, but it gives them, a sense of understanding how London comes together, and I think the LUAC's a good example of that. But as I say, Piali and Phil may have specific examples, on hard policy areas.
I mean, I think exactly as Luke says, in terms of dealings with officers, the ability of London to speak increasingly with one voice and to do so intelligently has been increasingly recognised, and that's paying off. And if I can use a particular example, which was itself nugatory but has proved very useful subsequently, when we were asked at very short notice, when Liz Truss became Prime Minister, to come up with a plan for investment zones in London, it was the structures that we had put in place underneath the partnership board around the economic recovery framework, around the officer-led group that had been responsible for that allowed us to come together and at very short notice, very quickly submit a really coherent request for I think it was 6 investment zones across the capital, which all of the boroughs and the members of the partnership board were sitting behind. And I think previously government had thought, the other combined authorities are better at this, but London can't get its act together. In fact, West Midlands ended up submitting 32 investment zones because they couldn't convene and reach that level of consensus. And while investment zones at that point went nowhere, there have been a number of subsequent funding rounds, one of which we were originally going to be excluded from, but officers were able to make the case to ministers that it wasn't simply, they wouldn't simply be getting the mayor's view as to what money was required, they would be getting London's view as to what money was required and how that could be deployed. That saw us bring in, I'd have to go back and check the numbers, but I think about 30 million for London in terms of capital investment, and we've seen the our allocations through the Levelling Up Fund increase as well through that. So I think it is making a real tangible difference, as well as sort of shifting the culture around what officials' perception of working with London is like.
Well done.
Remember, just to build on that and the future-facing work, I think for us, we're at the stage of the electoral cycle. The game is really, it's not a game, but the task at hand is really to influence the advice that senior civil servants will be giving to incoming ministers, so that they are very clear on the London story they're going to advise those incoming ministers on. We've got them tentatively lined up, that the officials who support the Levelling Up Advisory Council's London workstream, we've got them tentatively lined up to come back to a meeting sort of before they report back, which probably will be the autumn. And I don't think it's actually about the Levelling Up Advisory Council at all. I mean, that's a piece of set piece of theatre. I think what's really important is that those officials want to work with us on what do we need to know about London and what do we need to tell new ministers about London. And that's going to be such an important point when we can come together as partners to say, if you know nothing else about London, keep these 3 things in mind, and this is how we can help solve some of the crises.
Thank you, and I'd like to welcome Keir Hardy Primary School from Newham to the chamber. Hello all. We're just finishing off our question and answer session with the London Partnership Board, which is basically a board that brings lots of people together in London with responsibilities for things like the police, local councils, and tries to make decisions, good decisions, which are all joined up with everybody on the same page, and we're questioning them today to see whether that's working. It strikes me when Assembly Member Deval was talking about his possible mayoral campaign, that and how and the ways in which we might feed in without a mayoral campaign. We could perhaps make more recommendations through our reports on the GLA to the London Partnership Board, which I'm guessing you'd be receptive of. Yeah, thank you. And I think we're probably being too kind on question allocation, because Assembly Member Prince's question got taken, but I think you've got a supplementary.
Thank you, Chair. I've got no problem with the member asking my question. He did it very well and eloquently. Just a bit more on detail, actually, around government ministers. You've already talked about government ministers and someone being on the board, and I don't expect a question to be answered right now, but Luke, do you think you could avail the committee of the details of the number of ministers that you have met with over the last year, for instance?
Me personally?
Well, no, the board, or engaged on behalf of the board.
I mean, I think it's quite difficult, given the diverse nature of the board members, to be able to provide the Assembly, and I'm not sure the board members themselves will even have those details of each of their interactions with ministers. So I'd struggle a bit to provide that data, I think. I mean, we can provide and we can talk about the engagement we've had with with officials, with the Levelling Up Council and so forth. I think it's probably quite hard for us to, for example, go to, I don't know, chair of the G15, for example, and ask for her engagement patterns with ministers.
Yeah. I think what you've outlined is what we're looking for, really, not going to each board member and asking them as individuals, but it's just how the board is engaged. So
we have a, I think it's a bi-weekly meeting, or certainly more than monthly meeting with officials within the city and local government unit, individuals within, Phil will meet with colleagues from Department for the Environment and others with transport. So, there's a significant amount of work, and I'm happy to talk. I'm happy to summarise and put some context around that.
Lovely, thank you.
Thanks. I think to just provide some clarity, I think we're definitely talking about the government ministers being met with an LPB hat on, because obviously members of the board would meet with government ministers or departments for a lot of different reasons. Sorry, so I don't know if that helps with the question, but I think if you were going to give us a response later on the meetings, I don't think the work is asking you to go and ask the Commissioner, for example, how many times he's met the Home Sec. It's with the LPB hat on.
Yeah, and my problem, and I guess I'll go away and I'll certainly try and work something out. I guess my issue is that because of the nature of the board and the way the board works, that people, the mayor, when he's meeting ministers, won't be saying I'm here as a partnership board. George Gould, when she's meeting, won't be saying I'm here as a partnership. They'll be in the context of their day jobs, but they will be advocating on behalf of London through the board. So I probably just need to take that away and work out what we can usefully provide without it all just being a bit sort of meaningless, frankly.
I think it's trying to understand what the London Partnership Board specifically brings to those government relations. So it's answering the question in that context, if that's helpful. Perhaps it's not. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us today. That is the end of our Q&A, so do feel free to leave. Apart from you, Luke, I'm afraid we've got you in for the next item too. Can we note the report as background to put in questions to the invited guest?
Noted.
And can we delegate authority to me, the Chair, in consultation with the Deputy Chair and Party Group Leads, to agree any output arising from this discussion?
Agreed.
Brilliant. And I look to members now. Do you want to canter through these last items, or does anyone need a break?
Keep going.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. All right. Thank you so much, James, Phil and Daniel. Thank you for joining us. We're moving on to item number 7, the Strategy and Communications Update Report and changes to the GLA establishment. Luke, is there anything that you wanted to say on this? Are you happy to go straight to questions?
I'm very happy. I mean, this was a restructure that we took through a year ago. It was relatively minor in scope. It was bringing together teams. I think if you consider the conversation we've just had, it's part of that joined up thinking, working together, having a sense of a team which could provide a much more cohesive view of how we go about our business. And I would argue that it's been successful, and the team is operating very effectively.
Thank you. Any questions from members? No, in that case, can I ask the committee to note the update on the improved ways of working brought about by changes to the GLA establishment in strategy and communications?
Noted.
Brilliant. Thank you. And thank you very much for joining us today, Luke. And I think Zoe's coming into the chamber now. But in the meantime, if I can move us on to item 9, the draft committee timetable. And can I ask the committee to approve in principle the draft timetable of the London Assembly and committee meetings for the 24-25 year, and note that the final programme of meetings is subject to related decisions by the London Assembly at the annual meeting in May. So approve in principle, please.
Agreed.
Thank you. And if I can move us on as well to the GLA Oversight Committee work programme, and ask the committee to note its work programme for 23-24.
Noted.
And can I ask the committee to agree to delegate authority to the Deputy Chair in his role as chair of the Cost of Living Working Group, in consultation with the members of the working group, to agree the output arising from the working group's programme of work.
Agreed.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you. Brilliant. And the date of the next meeting will be the 11th of March at 2 p.m. in the chamber at City Hall, and we'll cycle back to Zoe and the Secretariat Quarterly Monitoring Report. Zoe, did you want to say anything?
Hi, thank you very much. Yeah, just to say feedback would be very welcome on this. It is a completely new format, and we've just completed the second version of this for Q3, so we'll be fully caught up from tomorrow, hopefully. But yeah, feedback would be very welcome on this new way of monitoring, and especially on the impact section, which is a bit experimental and piloting.
Thank you. Well, on presentation, I certainly, if they'd like to feedback myself, I think it's a really good way of presenting the information. I think have more of questions on the information, though, from Assembly Member Pigeon.
Yeah, thank you. I like the sort of new look, but I'm thinking in the next term, will you be putting into this performance measures around outputs and timeliness of outputs? Because we will have set, you know, assumptions and timescales for different types of outputs. We are once again at the end of the year where we are signing off hundreds of pieces of work to go out within a few weeks, which then doesn't have any impact in the same way. So how are you going to performance measure and put in those metrics for us to see in terms of outputs from our work?
Yeah, I think that's very fair, Caroline. Thank you. You're not the first to raise it with me, even today, that we have got a lot of outputs coming out in the next few weeks. There are some parts of that are cyclical, sort of systemic, that are we start the year, May, June, July, nothing ever comes out in that period, January, February, March. It always comes out, and over half of the outputs still to come out are from investigations that have ended in this quarter, so are not late. But some aren't and are late. So I do think it's worth acknowledging that. I know it's something that members wanted to avoid, and we haven't managed it this time, so I'm sorry about that. People are working very hard in the team to try to meet these records. There's also some things that aren't systemic that we have fixed, but a little bit too late for this year. The resources of the team, the SPAs and the PAs have been working very hard without enough resources as we've done the restructure and recruitment. So that's now sorted and will be solved next time. So that's just to address the current problem. In terms of monitoring, I think it's a good idea. I will admit I hadn't thought about it in this context. We did start monitoring the timeliness of briefings internally this year, and that was quite effective in ensuring that everyone had got their briefings 48 hours in advance as a minimum, 72 hours as a target, and that had really changed that conversation. So I think there is certainly internally, I would now be minded to be monitoring and providing an update on that. I would take members' views on whether that, once perhaps I could start internally and then take members' views on whether to include it in the external products as well. But I'd be happy either way, as long as I think the monitoring will have an effect, and I think you're right. I'd be happy to do that next year.
But as we're looking wider in terms of how we performance measure delivery across the GLA, then that has to apply equally to the Secretariat.
Internally.
And we haven't been delivering. Not, you know, once we get stuff out, it's great, but actually, and internally, we have discussed this heavily. And yes, you've outlined some of the issues. So I just think it might be you want to put it into this so we can actually start to really monitor and actually, you know, hold the team to account for that, and knowing that this is public, I think, is really important. So that might be something for the next term to want to look at.
Okay, happy to take that forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Assembly Member Pigeon. Do any other members have questions on this item? No? Okay. Then with that in mind, can I ask the committee to note the quarterly Secretariat monitoring report and agree to the proposed new format for the report?
Noted.
Noted and agreed. Thank you. Thank you, Zoe. Okay, moving on to any other business. That we do have one item of urgent business. It's the GLA Pay Award 2024, welcoming Mary Harpley into the chamber to discuss this. It's so clever. Slick, yeah. It would have been slicker if I hadn't brought attention to it, sorry. Mary, was there anything you wanted to say to introduce this report?
Thank you. Just to say that this comes to you as a late paper because the negotiations with Unison on the 24-25 pay award concluded just on Monday with notification from the branch that their members have accepted the proposed award of 4.5% for all staff from the 1st of April. So I'm bringing this to you here as I must formally to consult both you and through the same paper, the Mayor, on this proposed award before I sign the Chief Officer's decision, which I propose to do immediately after this meeting.
Thank you. Can I ask if there's any questions from members on this item? No? In that case, can we make clear that we've made a response to the Chief Officer's consultation and note the consideration set out in the report?
Yeah, agreed. Thank you.
Agreed.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Mary. Sorry, and with all that business being said and done, I can now end this meeting. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much.